Well, Trump has had to change his positions a lot of times. Initially, he positioned himself as an anti-war candidate, and then he got dragged into this really brutal war with Iran, and there seemed to be no way out of it. So he was getting a lot of criticism, and his response and his team's response was that he's actually trying to resolve an issue that's been haunting US foreign policy since the early 1980s. So that is the way he framed the whole situation. So there was definitely this historical perspective that he had in mind that he is resolving an issue. But because his sense of history is not as good as he probably thinks it is, he made two mistakes when going to Treaty of Versailles. So Versailles is the place where the Treaty of Versailles was signed in June 1919, and this is the pact that formally ended the First World War and kind of created a pathway, a charter for international relations in the coming years. So it was a moment in which the Allies could claim definitive victory. So the US, France, England, they could claim that they had decisively won the First World War. And this is what Trump is trying to signal here, that he has decisively won this war against Iran. Except that if you look at the terms, it seems a lot like none of the objectives that the US set out in the beginning, which included regime change, which included so-called, democracy, return of democracy to Iran, which included complete unconditional surrender, in the words of Trump. So, unconditional surrender of Iran. None of those things have happened. Iran has been allowed to maintain and even enhance its military capacities. It's getting its funds unfrozen. It'll be allowed to participate in the international markets and trade with other countries without the sanctions. Also, America's relations with its European allies have been strained, and now its relations with Israel are also under stress. So it is the Treaty of Versailles, but part two. But Trump doesn't realize that he's on the losing side of history. And second, he doesn't realize that after Versailles, you had momentarily had peace, but then you had the rise of fascism and the most unstable period in modern history. And part of the reason for that was that the international order had become so untenable, so unstable after the First World War, that you had the growth of monsters as well as heroes, anti-colonial movements, socialist movements across the world. And so in that sense, it signaled the end of the old school colonial empire. And America is at that point of transitioning from being the sole superpower of the world to being, a country that can be ignored in international affairs. It is an empire in decline. And I think this is what the significance of Versailles would be. So it is a repetition, but with very different connotation for the US. Oh yeah, I mean, you see, the idea was that after the Treaty of Versailles, you'll have a stable global order. And that's why, you had the League of Nations eventually formed. And there was this attempt to create some kind of global harmony. But in the 1920s, we also saw great challenges. First, the rise of fascism in Italy, then the great crash after the Depression in the late 1920s and 1930s. So the Depression basically escalated social tensions in the US as well as in Europe. And that's what, in a way, allowed Hitler to become the most powerful man in Germany and eventually in Europe briefly. And then you had resistance against those forces. You had the rise of anti-colonial movements in the Arab world. You had the rise of nationalist movements in India. You had the first major peasant revolts, including campesinos revolting in across Latin America. And then you had the buildup of the Red Army, which eventually defeated Hitler's army. You had the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, which fought the rising tide of Japanese imperialism. So you basically had this collapse of the established order. Something had fallen apart, but the new was not built very quickly. Antonio Gramsci, who was a socialist leader of the Italian Communist Party in the 1920s and was fighting Mussolini's rise to power, he put it very succinctly when he said, the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. In the interim, there are monsters. So you basically have an era of monsters. And precisely at this point in history, you see the collapse of the US, its global hegemony. But the new world will not be born without resistance. There will be massive transformations underway in Middle East, in Asia, in Latin America, and elsewhere. But you will also, while it opens up an opportunity for creating a better, more equitable global order, it will also create a situation of lawlessness, like we saw with the abduction of the Venezuelan president Maduro, or the continuing siege on Cuba by the US. So this is both a moment of immense danger and immense opportunities. And these two forces, the forces of darkness and the forces of hope, they collided in the 1920s, 30s, and 1940s, and I think they will collide in the coming decades as well. Well, I'm of the view that it's this argument that Israel somehow uses the US is a bit naive. The US has a massive is a massive hegemon, has been a massive hegemon for the last 70, 80 years, and it has its proxies and strategic interests. And Israel played a vital role in upholding those interests for the last many decades. The main interest was reversing the rising tide of Arab nationalism as represented by Jamal Abdel Nasser and his supporters. So Nasserism was sweeping the Middle East in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, including in Saudi Arabia. You had one of the Prince Talal, who basically revolted against the Saudi family, the royal family, and became a Nasserite. You had a Nasserite revolution in Libya with Colonel Gaddafi. You had revolutions in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere. So Nasserism had a lot of legitimacy. And the US could not have reversed it on its own without creating a quagmire worse than Vietnam. It relied on Israel to destroy the legitimacy of Nasserism. Basically, the defeat in 1967 that Israel was able to impose on the Arab populations, that created a subjectivity of defeat. And that is what allowed the center of gravity of the Arab world to shift from Egypt and Iraq and Syria and Libya towards the Gulf states, which became these like securitized zones, backed by the US and secretly by Israel. And that is the kind of carving out of space that the US preferred. And Israel was a very, very important player in that. Not to mention ensuring that the Palestinian question, which kind of really brings together both the Arab and the Muslim world, and now other parts of the global South, that question remained suppressed. And I think what's happened is Israel is unable to impose that kind of discipline or that kind of defeat upon the people of the Middle East. Despite the genocide in Gaza, people are fighting back. They're refusing to surrender. In Lebanon, people are fighting back. In Yemen, people are fighting back. In the way Iran has fought back heroically, it has kind of upended the calculations of those in Washington. So I think this is one of the major changes. Also, the public opinion has shifted so drastically against Israel in the US, especially among young people. The campus revolt since late 2023 has really alienated young people from America's foreign policy, particularly with regards to Israel. And that is now showing in American politics. You have people like Zoran Mamdani winning elections in New York, which would have been unthinkable a few years ago. Similarly, many important members of the House and the Senate are claiming that they will not take any APAC money. It's almost become taboo now. So, that kind of a change is a paradigm shift. And what J.D. Vance expressed when he basically told Israel to behave itself, basically, suggesting that we're the only country on the planet that is still taking you guys seriously. He's expressing frustration because the plans that Israel has for the region are no longer tenable considering the capacity of the US. I mean, for Israel to create greater Israel, for Israel to destroy Iran completely, destroy Turkey completely, destroy basically every, they want to create these zones of exception and statelessness across the region that they can control. That would require constant US presence on the ground and constant war, which would give America's adversaries a massive opportunity to create another Vietnam, except much worse. I mean, just imagine Iraq on a much, much grander scale. Russia will get involved, China will get involved. So this would not be in the strategic interest of the US. So I think there is a slight divergence that's happening. I would not say that that alliance has been broken, because alliances are made through material interests and material institutions, and there's still a lot that unites the US and Israel in the long term. But for now, the alliance has cooled off, and there's a very real opportunity for people in the US who are critical of America's foreign policy to take the initiative and basically call for a more independent and fair foreign policy, knowing that there will always be limits to such a discourse in the US because of its economic and military interests and because of the military industrial complex, but it's a fight worth fighting.